we are going to go ahead and get into the slideshow here. So today we're talking about growth and development. This is a 1-hour webinar, and today our goals are to define and understand growth and development. We're going to talk about the principles of growth and development, and then primarily we're going to focus on factors that affect growth and development. So for you, as you're serving youth and infants and toddlers who have gone through trauma, we're going to talk about how that affects them and their growth and development, and then talk about abuse and neglect. And then we're going to learn about resilience and how you as a foster parent can help to help children in building resilience and overcoming the deficits that they have. And so we will talk briefly about the difference between growth and development. Let's take the video off here so you can see this. So growth simply refers to the quantitative measure of how a child is growing physically. So results in the growth of their size, so their body and organs grow. And development, on the other hand, is physiological change. So it's quantitative. And this has to do with psychological, emotional, social maturation that's measured through observing a child as they are growing up. All right, these are the principles of growth and development. Growth and development follows a similar, predictable sequence. It moves from the general to the specific. It's a continuous process. It proceeds at different rates for different children, and then all areas of development are interrelated. All right, follows a similar predictable sequence. So this just says that children develop in relatively the same way. They follow a similar sequence. And so some children will take more or less time with each behavior or skill, and some children will move forward and then regress for a time. That's not uncommon, and then move forward again. Some kids are going to skip behaviors as they move forward and as they're learning. So an example of that would simply be a child who ends up walking before they ever crawl. So sometimes they skip one of those steps in the developmental process. All right, next one says that development proceeds from the general to the specific. And what this means is that development is always moving in a forward direction. So it proceeds from the top down when you're looking at an infant and thinking about how their body is both growing and how they're learning the skills that they'll need to start learning new skills, and then from the center of the body out towards the limbs. And so we'll look at this on the next slide. But it moves from the general to the specific and from the less complex to the more complex. So an example of this is that those larger muscles tend to learn behaviors before the small muscles do. So in the arms and the legs, an infant is waving and kicking their arms around before they learn later on to use the small muscles in their fingers to pinch something or hold a pencil and gain those fine motor control skills that they'll need later as they learn new skills. And then bodily changes. So as an infant is growing, those changes happen in a sequential order and serve as a foundation for new abilities that they're going to gain as they get older and as they develop more. Just evidence of God's design that obviously the body follows the physical process of maturation that's needed to have those motor skills and develop and mature. All right, so this is just an image of that. The cephalocaudal refers to the fact that the improvement in structure starts in the head, where the brain, the center of all the operation of the body is, and then moves downward. And then proximodistal is that development moves out from the center of the body towards the extremity. So like I said, those larger muscles in the arms and legs develop first and then moves out towards the smaller muscles. All right, development obviously is a continual process. Learned behaviors become the building blocks for new behaviors and skills. There's continuity from one phase to the next, and they will continue to add new behaviors and skills while they're still perfecting the abilities in the other areas. So speech, you can see this in speech. A child as an infant is starting to gurgle and coo and then kind of put some syllables together, and then eventually they're forming words. Those words then get strung together into small phrases. Those phrases become sentences, then eventually more grammatically correct sentences and paragraphs and stories. And so the progression keeps moving, and you don't always see a defined line between those things. Most often you won't. It's just a progression that keeps moving forward. And same with writing. or drawing. So a child first has to gain those fine motor skills in order to even hold a pencil. And then there's little scribbles, and then eventually maybe they're able to follow a line and then do shapes and letters and so forth and so on. Development proceeds obviously at different rates for different children. If you've interacted with children at all, you know that obviously they are all individual. And in particular, as you're serving foster children, you will see that their development looks very different at times from the development of, say, your own children, nieces, nephews, other kids you've interacted with. And so they may be behind in development, but their development will continue as they're with you. And hopefully you can foster things that they'll need to encourage them catching up in some of those developmental areas where they are lacking because of the abuse and the trauma, the neglect that they've been through. So it's not uniform among children, but it is a constant. All right, all development is interrelated. So there are different ways to categorize, as you can see, the domains of childhood development. Some divide this into 5, some 3, some 7, but all of these things, so language, cognitive skills, gross motor, fine motor, self-help and adaptive, the social emotional, the moral and values. That's one way over here on the left that you see that somebody divides it up. But all of those things are working together towards the full development of a child. And so that's fairly obvious. Stages of growth and development, just briefly. The prenatal stage, so embryonic, is from conception up to 8 weeks of development. Fetal goes from 8 weeks embryonic to prenatal, 8 weeks up to 40 weeks, so up to birth. So that's before the child even enters the world. Infancy goes from birth to the end of that first month. Infancy is from 1 month to the end of that first year. Early childhood goes from years 1 to 6. The toddler is 1 to 3. Preschool between 3 and 6. Middle childhood is from 6 to 12 years. And then the adolescence is 13 to 18, late childhood. All right, there are many theories on childhood development. We're going to just talk briefly about 6. We'll watch a couple of videos about 2 of these. But what you should know about the theories of childhood development is that many of these were developed before we had the research that we now have on neuroscience. And so some of them match up pretty closely with what we know about the brain and how the brain grows and develops in brain chemistry. Others not so much. So there are helpful aspects of many of these. And for our purposes and learning about children's development as regards to how you serve them as foster parents, it's not essential, obviously, that you're an expert on all of the developmental theories, but they can be helpful. And so we'll just watch a video. Now we're going to watch one about Erik Erikson's theory. And so we'll go ahead and do this, and then we'll talk through, after we watch one more of these videos, about just this.
Erikson's theory of psychosocial development identifies 8 stages which a healthy individual should pass through from birth to death. At each stage, we encounter different needs, ask new questions, and meet people who influence our behavior and learning. Stage 1. Basic trust versus mistrust. As infants, we ask ourselves if we can trust the world, and we wonder if it's safe. We learn that if we can trust someone now, we can also trust others in the future. If we experience fear, we develop doubt and mistrust. The key to our development is our mother. Stage 2. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. In our early childhood, we experience ourselves and discover our body. We ask, is it okay to be me? If we are allowed to discover ourselves, then we develop self-confidence. If we are not, we can develop shame and self-doubt. Both parents now play a major role. Stage 3. Initiative versus guilt. In preschool, we take initiative, try out new things, and learn basic principles like how round things roll. We ask, is it okay for me to do what I do? If we are encouraged, we can follow our interests. If we are held back or told that what we do is silly, we can develop guilt. We are now learning from the entire family. Stage 4. Industry versus inferiority. Now we discover our own interests and realize that we are different from others. We want to show that we can do things right. We ask if we can make it in this world. If we receive recognition from our teachers or peers, we become industrious, which is another word for hard-working. If we get too much negative feedback, we start to feel inferior and lose motivation. Our neighbors and schools now influence us the most. Stage 5. Identity versus role confusion. During adolescence, we learn that we have different social roles. We are friends, students, children, and citizens. Many experience an identity crisis. If our parents now allow us to go out and explore, we can find identity. If they push us to conform to their views, we can face role confusion and feel lost. Key to our learning are our peers and role models.
All right, so they were going to go on to talk about post-adolescent stages, so we won't watch those. But Erickson's big thing is that he had a conflict that was going to happen in each of them, and then some kind of accomplishment that needed to happen in order for development to move to the next stage. And then we will also watch a brief video on Piaget. So here we go.
Piaget's theory argues that we have to conquer 4 stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. Second, the pre-operational stage. Third, the concrete operational stage. And fourth, the formal operational stage. Only once we have gone through all the stages, at what age can vary, we are able to reach full human intelligence. 1. The sensory motor stage, ages birth to 2. In the sensory motor stage, we develop through experiences and movement our 5 senses. Our brain wants to see, hear, smell, taste and touch as much as possible. First, we start with simple reflexes, and soon after, we develop our first habits. From 4 months old, we become aware of things beyond our own body, and then as we get older, we learn to do things intentionally. A key milestone is the development of working memory, or in Piaget terms, our realization of object permanence. Before that, our mum can show and then hide a teddy, and we would think it's gone. After, we understand that objects continue to exist, even when we can't see them. We start becoming curious about everything. We want to smell flowers, taste food, listen to sounds, and talk to strangers. To explore more, we move. We learn to sit, crawl, stand, walk, and even to run. This increased physical mobility consequently leads to increased cognitive development. But we remain egocentric, meaning we can perceive the world only from our own point of view. 2. The pre-operational stage, ages 2 to 7. Our thinking is mainly categorized through symbolic functions and intuitive thoughts. We have lots of fantasies and believe objects are alive. As we are not able to apply specific cognitive operations, Piaget calls this stage pre-operational. We learn to speak and understand that words, images, and gestures are symbols for something else. When we draw our family, we are not concerned about drawing each person to scale, but rather with their symbolic meanings. We love to play pretend, which allows us to experience something new and learn a lot. At around age 4, most of us become very curious and ask many questions. We want to know everything. We can call it the birth of primitive reasoning. Piaget calls it the intuitive age, because while we realize that we have a vast amount of knowledge, we have no idea how we acquired it. Our thinking in this stage is still pretty egocentric. We think others see the world like we do, and still don't understand that they see it differently. 3. The concrete operational stage, ages 7 to 11. We finally discover logic, and we develop concrete cognitive operations, such as sorting objects in a certain order. One example of this is inductive reasoning, which means that if we see someone eating a cookie, we can draw a conclusion and then make a generalization. And we now get the concept of conservation. We understand that if we pour orange juice from a normal glass to a taller one, the amount stays the same. Our younger sister will pick the taller glass, thinking she gets more. By the same logic, we only now can understand that if 3 plus 5 equals 8, then 8 minus 3 must equal 5. Our brain learns to rearrange our thoughts, to classify and build concrete operational mental structures. For example, we now know that we can reverse an action by doing the opposite. Excited by our new mental abilities, we apply them in conversations, activities, when we learn to write, and in school. As a result, we get to know ourselves better. We begin to understand that our thoughts and feelings are unique and not necessarily those of others. That means that we learn to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. 4. The formal operational stage, age 12 plus. Once we become teenagers, we become formally operational. We now have the ability to think more rationally about abstract concepts and hypothetical events. Our advanced cognitive abilities allow us to understand abstract concepts such as success and failure, love and hate. We form a deeper understanding of our own identity and our morality. We now also think that we understand why people behave the way they behave, and as a result, can become more compassionate. Our brain can now do deductive reasoning, which means we can compare two statements and reach a logical generalization. Our new mental skills allow us to plan our life systematically and prioritize, and we can make assumptions about events that have no necessary relation to reality. We can now also philosophize and just think about thinking itself. Our new sense for our identity now also creates egocentric thoughts, and some start to see an imaginary audience watching them all the time. Piaget believed in lifelong learning, but insisted that the formal operational stage is the final stage of our cognitive development.
All right, so like I said, the developmental theories are helpful in just thinking about a variety of people's views, people who study this, their views on what your child is capable of at different stages and how they're learning. Obviously, when you're dealing with children in foster care, knowing that it's important to have them assessed for where they actually are developmentally, because a child who may be in body in years, 8 years old, may really only be developmentally at the age of a 2 or 3 or 4-year-old. So the theories are helpful, but we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here. So Freud obviously had the psychosexual theory. He said that personality was set very early on, and that this was a lot primarily based on early experiences. And he obviously had a heavy emphasis on bodily pleasure, and that resulting in a child's development. We saw Erikson, so there's conflict in each stage that leads to them accomplishing these tasks that are crucial towards development. And then Piaget, children think differently than adults. That was fairly revolutionary then, that they can't all think the same, that children don't think the same as adults. And so that influences the way we understand and interact with the world. A few more. Bowlby said that early relationships with caregivers are what play the crucial role. So that attachment theory, which has become fairly crucial in the way that we view children in foster care who've had disrupted attachment. And so that sets the foundation for attachment theory now and how we view the way children form those early relationships and how that impacts later relationships. Social learning, this is Albert Bandura. So behaviors are learned through observation and modeling, both observing actual people doing the behaviors and then even observation of reading about them in books or hearing about them. in conversation. And then behavioral, Skinner and Watson worked a lot with association rewards and then punishment to drive development and drive behaviors and skills. All right, so development refers to the increase in skill and function. Remember, this is physiological and psychological and social and emotional. This is not growth, which is simply a quantitative measure of size. And then development follows a similar predictable sequence. It moves from the general to the specific, is continual, it proceeds at different rates, and is interrelated. There are many theories of human growth and development, and so we touched on those briefly. All right, now we're going to get into the factors that affect growth and development. So obviously genetic factors, which are both prenatal and postnatal. We'll talk about other things that prenatally and postnatally can affect a child. And then we'll hopefully spend the bulk of the time on toxic stress and abuse and neglect and how those things affect a child's development. All right, so genetic impact as a child is developing in utero. There are genes that are going to affect their intelligence, their aptitude, their body structure, height, weight, the color of their hair and their eyes, sex, whether male or female, is genetically determined, and that affects growth and development. Most of us can remember the middle school years when many of the girls were towering over boys and developing more quickly, and then the boys eventually catch up. But that's sex and genes have an impact on growth and development. All right, prenatal factors. So we will just talk about nutrition, illness, socioeconomic status, hormones, and then teratogens, conditions, and substances that increase the risk for prenatal problems. So obviously when a woman is pregnant and she has access to good nutrition, or she is enduring some kind of illness, that can impact the health of her baby. As the baby is growing and developing, good nutrition tends towards a healthier baby. And so that is tied pretty heavily with socioeconomic status as well. A woman who is in decent living conditions tends to have better prenatal care medically, and then also has access to nutritious foods, is generally more apt to exercise, have better sleep patterns. And so all of those things have an impact on the baby. Illness, so there are obviously many illnesses that can affect a baby's health. Back many years ago, they found that rubella would lead to prenatal deformation of the baby's limbs. And so that was something that happened a long time ago. And there are other things now that still can affect a baby as they're developing. And then hormones, they found that medically taken hormones obviously can have an impact on the way that a child is growing. Other medicines that can have negative effects on a baby as they're developing would be convulsants, or anticonvulsants, tetracycline, anticoagulants, bromides, and then again, many hormones. So there are obviously many medications, psychoactive drugs that can affect a developing child. And these are things that as foster parents, you may run into if you serve really little ones who were exposed prenatally to drugs. Cocaine can result in premature delivery, low birth weight, smaller head circumference, and then subtle but significant deficits later on in children. So behavior problems, self-regulation, cognitive deficits, information processing, sustained attention to tasks, all of these things, obviously, as you're dealing with a child later, become significant as they're trying to reach their potential. And so exposure to drugs is a big part of what you're facing if you've had a child whose mother was using drugs at the time of her pregnancy. Alcohol can result in fetal alcohol syndrome, which is characterized by facial abnormalities, small head size, flattened nose, wide eye spacing, and narrow top lip. Intellectual impairments, impaired physical growth, learning disabilities, behavioral problems. Heroin can lead to an infant's having postnatal withdrawal once they're born. So that looks like hyperirritability, tremors, convulsions. They can have a shortened attention span later in life, be hyperactive, have sleep disturbances. And then tobacco can lead to low birth weight and increased risk of limb malformations and urinary tract issues. Something else that's true is that you may be dealing with a child and you don't know, obviously, their prenatal history, and DSS doesn't always know the extent of what happened to a child before they were born. And so there may be things that you're facing in their behavior and their cognitive struggles that are tied to these, but not knowing the full history, DSS isn't even going to be able to tell you all of those things. All right, some postnatal factors. Obviously, there are, we could spend all day talking about all of the things that can affect a child once they're born, but we'll just touch briefly. Obviously, their living environment, the social environment in which they live, the type and of nurture and love, parental engagement that they get, going back to obviously that attachment issue. Are they being engaged with regularly and in a healthy way? External stressors, we'll talk about toxic stress. We'll watch a video about that. Nutrition and diet, again, that ties closely with other factors as well. The number of siblings that they have, their position in their family, that affects the way that a child develops. The geography, where they live, which down below that you see climate and season. Those things are pretty closely tied. Socioeconomics, the school setting, the quality of the education they're receiving, their relationships, their family structure, play plays a huge role. If a child has access to play, is able to play, or if they're not given opportunities for developmentally appropriate play and age-appropriate toys. So just thinking about those, obviously, if a child lives in an enriching community, they have better access to things like parks and libraries and community activities, sports, and good schools. All of those things play a role in how a child develops. If a child lives in a community that's not safe for them to be out in, they're going to spend a lot more time indoors, maybe not engaging with others, not engaging in healthy activities that are good for them at that age. And so even where you live will have a pretty significant impact on the ability you have to develop as a child. All right, we're going to watch this video, which talks about the impact of trauma on child development. And this is put out by an organization in Ohio that work with children on attachment. And they work with children who've been adopted. But what they have to say is pertinent, obviously, to children in foster care as well.
I think what we want to address then are some of the specific areas that trauma particularly interrupts when children experience this trauma early and chronically, this rather complex trauma. We see, for example, major delays in cause and effect thinking.
And that is one area that's particularly bothersome to families because they continue to wonder, why does she continue to do the same thing? Maybe not even day after day, but hour after hour. When we've corrected it, she's had a consequence, we've explained it, and then it occurs again. We see children really very unable to predict with any kind of accuracy what their consequence will be and the impact of what they do, what it has on others. So I think families are frustrated by children who don't seem to be learning from experience.
I got a mom in the office very recently who said, you know, I've told her 1,000,000 times, when you're playing with other kids, don't be bossing them so much. And she said back outside she goes, and immediately she said, I can hear her voice bossing these kids around. And she said, I just wanted to get on the roof and just scream over how she doesn't learn, you know, over and over and over and over. She said it's just particularly difficult to have this child who just cannot seem to learn.
And I always think it's important for people to know that cause and effect thinking is as critical to every other developmental thing that's going to occur. Because without good cause and effect thinking, they're not going to develop conscience at any time.
That's very, very problematic in the home, to have a child who just is not internalizing that set of morals and values that you want them to have, that will carry them through life.
Right. And it causes peer problems and problems at school, and every sphere of their life is impacted by this lack of cause and effect thinking. Abstract thinking is often delayed, and before conscience can develop, or maybe simultaneous to conscience development, would be the development of abstract thinking. So while people expect their child to have some kind of internal moral regulator at 7 or 8, we're finding that kids who've had trauma and interrupted development may not develop that component until much later. So if the child does not have good cause and effect thinking and doesn't have abstract thinking, we should just assume that there's not going to be moral thinking yet. That deficit also impacts their social and peer relationships. We find that kids like either older kids or younger kids are age mates. In a sense, they don't have age mates because of the developmental scatter.
Right.
And that's very frustrating, I think, for families who want their child to be able to go to a birthday party and have friends over and get invited to play dates, and often that doesn't happen with their age mates.
Well, and often when there are existing children in the family, then we see that even their siblings begin to abandon them over time because I have outgrown you. You know, you're in this earlier development, and so instead of us growing up together, the gap sometimes almost gets bigger, and I outgrow you. So it isn't even that maybe I don't like you or I don't want you in the family. I don't have anything in common with you anymore.
Right.
And sometimes it is I don't like you because you don't act like you should. You know, we kind of, I think, sometimes we would like, you know, kids 9, 10, 11, and 12 to understand all of this impact on trauma, and certainly we should work toward educating them to get it to the best of their ability. But on a day-to-day basis, we can't expect that they're always keeping that in mind, that they always have the skills to navigate this younger child. And so some days there are just days where I don't like you because you can't play well with me. And so I want to go to my friend's house without you. So for everyone who was expecting, again, this nice playmate and this fun, and we'll just be adding on more birthday parties and more vacations and things, that sometimes is just not the reality because of the developmental delays that the trauma has caused.
Right. And I think I'm forever reminding parents that it's their job to understand the new child in the family, but they really can't expect their other children to have the same level of empathy and understanding and acceptance of somebody who's kind of tarnishing their world at school and embarrassing them and being completely out of line in many occasions.
When we're wondering if a child is adjusting in a family, we want to look at, is that development moving? Are they beginning to catch up to their chronological age? And then if not, we likely want to consider getting a variety of interventions, you know, to begin to get that moving so that the family can ultimately get the experiences that they want with their child and within their sibling unit in the family.
All right, so I just found that helpful. Obviously, them talking about the developmental scatter, that children who've experienced trauma. So every child in foster care has experienced trauma. Many times there's multiple traumas. If they've been abused and neglected, they've been ripped out of their home, which adds another trauma, even though it was, God willing, the best thing for them. That is a trauma for them. And so when children have that history of enduring multiple traumas, multiple adverse childhood experiences, they are often developmentally delayed. So this is, there's another video that they have, and I didn't want to spend the time to watch 2 of them because it was fairly long, but they show the developmental scatter. So a child who was at 7 years, 11 months, and they do attachment services. So that's, they're tracking at an assessment where the child is. But you can see here just the level that the child was at. So initially at the assessment, when they brought the child in, the child was functioning in communication, for receptive communication, at the stage or at the age of a 1-year-old, and they're 7. And they talked about how frustrating it can be, both obviously for the parents, but also for peers. So for schoolmates, for siblings, for your own biological children, for cousins, nieces, nephews, for other kids who are interacting with the children that you're serving It can be hard to understand why they're having social problems. But when they're functioning at such a reduced level from where they are age-wise, it can create real struggles. So interpersonal skills, coping skills, their ability to play in a developmentally appropriate way. Many of them have had to mature in some ways very quickly, although they're still very behind. But so they don't always know how to play, and that can be frustrating for you as a foster parent. So just knowing that getting services, as they talked about, getting interventions that will help a child to help you to know where the child is, but also help the child to progress in their development to reach age-appropriate states. That cause and effect thinking that they talked about, that's crucial to their moral understanding, the abstract thinking, and all of those things play together for both the way that they interact with you as foster parents, but also the way that they interact with their peers. All right, so we're going to talk about abuse and neglect and toxic stress. So stress, obviously, in early childhood, a child being exposed over and over again to stress and not having that stress relieved has significant impact on the way that they develop. So we're going to go again to another video, and this one talks about toxic stress.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increased stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems, with serious, lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones.
Okay, so obviously a child who endures that kind of stress and abuse is, their brain is not able to function at the level that they should be able to because of what they've been through. So that leads to difficulty as they're growing and should be developing. And we're gonna watch one more here on the science of neglect and how it affects a child.
Everyone in a community has a vested interest in everyone else's children because everyone else's children determine the next adult population that makes for a successful society. Built into our biology is the need to have responsive interactions with adults.
Neglect for children is when they don't get what the brain is expecting to get, what the child is expecting to get, what we are biologically prepared and waiting for, which is input from those around us.
It's this back and forth serve and return interaction that literally shapes the architecture of the brain.
Serve and return begins when a child looks at something or observes something, makes an utterance, and that represents the serve. And the return is when the parent notices the child doing these things and responds to the child.
under conditions where serve and return is broken. You literally are pulling away what is the essential ingredient of the development of human brain architecture.
It was a really compelling series of experiments where they started by videotaping the mother and the baby engaging in cooing and smiling. And then they asked the mother to basically put on a blank face and not respond at all. When a baby is not attended to, that is a sign of danger to the baby biologically. So the stress systems become activated.
In a brain that is constantly bathed in stress hormones, not that's up and down, that comes with normal development, certain key synapses, the connections between nerves, fail to form, and critical regions of the brain.
So neglect both fails to provide the stimulation that's needed to develop the basic architecture, and when it's at a certain level, is one of the most potent activators of the stress biology of a young child. So you get a double whammy.
Science points to 4 categories of this spectrum of neglect. The first category would be what's called occasional inattention, where children experience responsiveness most of the time, but occasionally adults don't respond. There's no harm in that, and in fact, there's probably some benefit.
A child can learn to self-soothe and explore the environment, and all of those opportunities build brain architecture.
The second category, scientists would call chronic understimulation, is where on a regular basis, children have less interaction with the adults around them than is needed for healthy development.
Those children typically, when provided with enriched learning opportunities and more typical levels of serve and return, will show catch-up.
The third category is what science would call severe neglect in a family where not only are there prolonged periods of inattention and lack of responsiveness, but often also associated with not being fed enough, not being bathed enough, not having basic needs met.
Neglect is a huge problem in the U.S. Children are much more likely to be neglected than they are to experience any other kind of maltreatment.
We see the child really being at risk for much more substantial kinds of deficits down the road that don't necessarily get easily fixed or ameliorated. This is where we really need to think about more complicated and often more intensive strategies to help undo those effects.
The fourth category.
All right, we're going to stop there before they talk about an institutional context, because what they were talking about there with the family context and how much of an impact that has. It's hard to hear that the children that you're serving, particularly those who endured abuse and neglect for any significant amount of time, those things are harder for them to overcome. And for their development, it is going to be a challenge. And so physical and mental abuse, as you see here, can fix the brain in this stress response mode. So depending on the age of the child, when an infant is under chronic stress, they can be apathetic, they can not do well with feeding, they can withdraw and fail to thrive because of those things. The typical fight response, which is that they'll cry, so there's the fight or flight. And so typically an infant, to have their needs met, will cry, but instead they're seeing that that doesn't elicit the response that they need. They're not getting what they need from crying, so that leads to more like temper tantrums and aggressive behaviors. Inattention, withdrawal, a child will eventually start to have those issues, and some abused and neglected children learn to react instead of with outward responses with immediately then just freezing. And so children who do that, the adults can see that as an act of defiance, when for them that is their survival skill. It's a mechanism that they've developed in order to survive in the environment that they were in. So things that you're seeing, which can be really disturbing behaviors as they're developing, and can be frustrating to you, but these are behaviors that they've developed as ways to survive. And so knowing that means that you're going to need extra patience, extra understanding, trying to meet them where they are in their development, which is not probably where they are in their age. And so dealing with the things that come from that, the mood swings, impulsiveness, sleep problems, hyperactivity, defiant behaviors that are going to require extra grace and help from you. All right, so some special considerations as you think about the children that you serve, the feelings versus reality when it comes to how safe and secure that they are. So a child who comes into your home may have various areas where they're behind developmentally. Growth-wise, they can be underweight, overweight. They've gone hungry in some instances when there's neglect going on. And so what they feel to be true versus what is true, Lord willing, in your home, they are safe, they are cared for, they are well fed, they have access to anything that they need. But for a child who has not had that as the reality for a long time, they may not be able to grasp that for a while. And so this is where you see why many of you have heard about children who, or maybe you've experienced children who hoard food or hide things or lie to you. And those behaviors are not coming out of a child who morally understands the wrong in those things, or the inappropriateness, or the lack of need for hiding their food. But there were survival skills, and it can take years for a child to overcome those negative, unnecessary behaviors that they had developed in order to survive in their previous environment. And so this is where access to therapy, mental health professionals, counselors, people who work with children on these issues are going to be so crucial. And so, as we've encouraged many times before, please pursue these things early rather than late. Sometimes children are dealing with behaviors, and so we want to help them as much as we can, not realizing that some of these things are maybe things that are beyond our scope of knowing how to deal with, because they're not, in a sense, normal children who are developing normally. So pediatricians and therapists and others who work with children who've been abused and neglected will help a caregiver to give a child the love and attention that they need, help them with appropriate areas of giving extra stimulation to bring them along in their development, help them know how to discipline in a way that's both consistent and appropriate for where they are developmentally, giving the child extra help in areas where they're developmentally behind. So when a child needs extra play, extra holding, extra cuddling, exposing them to things that they maybe have not had before because of the situations that they come from, improving their language, working with them on having face-to-face contact that may be uncomfortable for them at the beginning because of the lack of that they've had in the past. So social interaction, as they talked about that in that previous video, how difficult social interactions can be for children, both because they are often missing empathy, so they're not good at interacting with others and empathizing with others and understanding the needs and wants of others, and because they are developmentally missing cause and effect thinking, which has a great impact on the way that you interact socially with others. So it can be a real challenge for them to be in a school setting. They can have a hard time making friends. Kids don't want to be with them or play with them because they don't play in a way that makes sense to them. And then thinking about the way that children may come into your home and have behaviors that are shocking morally to you. So the language that can come out of a two-year-old's mouth, not because she understands the words that she's saying, but because she's simply mimicking what she's heard in her home, or sexualized behaviors that are coming out of a 2, 3, 4, or 5-year-old, them wanting to act out on things, unfortunately and grievously, that they've been exposed to, can be really hard for foster parents to deal with. It can be shocking to our conscience, and our reaction can be very strong, particularly when those things are happening around our own children. And so knowing that a child has not developed an appropriate conscience and these behaviors are coming out of their what they've learned and what they've learned to survive. And so we're viewing their behavior sometimes as immoral, but they're viewing these things as meeting needs that they have. And so rather than overreacting to these really difficult behaviors, foster parents need to find the need that comes behind these developmentally inappropriate behaviors, these morally inappropriate behaviors, and try to meet the needs in an appropriate way and reframe the child's thinking so that they understand that they need to meet their needs in a different way too. And so you are not going to find quick fixes for those kinds of behaviors, and it's going to take, like we've said, extra patience. There's no magic pill. It's going to take time. And often it's going to take extra support than you had with raising your own children, extra training, extra interventions from professionals around you who become a support system for the child and for you as you are dealing with these difficult situations. But if you stick with them, and if you are there for them as they're trying to learn these new things and trying to move in their development past these really difficult behaviors and lack of developmental skills, you can really have a major impact on the lifelong, or the impact can be lifelong for the child, which is why foster care is so crucial and why what you're doing is so important. So as you help them grow and develop, you're going to work with them on bonding and building those healthy attachments. As more and more children are placed in foster care, there will be more and more children who have poor attachment. And studies show that this is getting worse, but that appropriate treatment can enhance their brain development, their ability to attach. And obviously prevention is key, but where there hasn't been prevention, good therapies and really engaged foster parents can help facilitate healthy attachment growing even after it's been undermined early on. So meeting their needs and then helping them to learn how to accomplish their own tasks. A foster child often has not had their needs met in an appropriate way. So babies bonding and seeing that life is predictable and that the adults around them will meet their needs. And that's a growing process. So as a child sees that their needs are being met, they come to a point in development where they want to start accomplishing tasks for themselves. And so a major part of what a parent does is meeting those needs early on and then working progressively to help a child meet some of their own needs and accomplish tasks. And that's huge for their development and becoming an adult. What we want in children is not for them to be dependent on us for their lifetime, if God has given them the ability to be independent. But we want for them to grow and be independent and successful in living in that way. So you will need to give them unconditional love and support, which can be really trying in the times when their behavior is disrupting your family's life, is disrupting your day. And so praying for extra grace on those days. And again, reaching out to the resources around you who can be a support system during those times. When a child is moved into a different foster care placement, it adds more trauma. And so there are times when a family just cannot, because of the behaviors that are coming out of a child, continue caring for them. But we would plead with you to consider very carefully when you are needing for a child to be moved, because every time a child moves, it creates more trauma and adds further struggle to their development as they've formed some kind of attachment and then have to leave it again. All right, so that we've come to the end of our webinar. and there will be a test for you to that we'll put the link out for very shortly.